Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning in support of the motion to borrow US $7.945 million, which is counterpart financing to reconstruct the Millennium Highway Road and the West Coast Road, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as one of the more green parliamentarians, I enjoy parliamentary discussion, I enjoy parliamentary debate. I sit back and I learn from my colleagues, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I cannot sit down in this chamber and be the recipient of a line to mislead the country and not stand up. So, Mr. Speaker, this was the reason why I stood up, and I think the honourable member knows very well what he was inciting with the message that he was sending out. But all that being said, Mr. Speaker, I find it passing strange that the honourable member would not support the lending of the counterpart financing in support of the intention of the repairs of the road, because Mr. Speaker, with the exception of the honourable leader of the opposition, every member opposite represent a constituency where that road is significantly used by members, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, this is a road that I use almost every day, Mr. Speaker, and sometimes when I drive on that road, Mr. Speaker, it's a roller coaster, Mr. Speaker. It is a roller coaster. I think what the member opposite should be very wary of, at least from in my recent memory, Mr. Speaker, the number of fatalities we've had on that highway, that Millennium Highway. And I don't have the statistics, Mr. Speaker, but I am very certain that he may well know somebody who may have either lost a limb or may have lost a life, Mr. Speaker. And as a government, Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important when we recognize, what we can do to improve road conditions, to mitigate some of these, Mr. Speaker, we should, When you think of some of the mishaps that have happened on that road, Mr. Speaker, it brings back some very sad memories. And I know my colleague from Castries South would appreciate some of the thinking as it relates to something that have happened on that highway, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, as a government, we recognize the growing use of the Millennium Highway, particularly now, Mr. Speaker, that the OKU hospital has moved in that into, and we can expect a lot more traffic on that highway, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, dead men tell no tales. So I cannot ask anybody, who has been in an accident and where they have lost their life as to, was it as a result of the bumping? Yes, you may have had some feet, but if it was a safely constructed road, would you have had that same impact, Mr. Speaker? These are the kind of things we have to think of, Mr. Speaker, when you come to the House and you indicate that you don't think the timing is right to put in $8 million into. Mr. Speaker, I have heard members opposite speak to this government seem to be focusing on a lot of road development, and Mr. Speaker, in my community, and there's a lot of conversation as it relates to electioneering projects. Election is coming, Mr. Speaker. As far as I to this Parliament, from 2017, every project we have done, the opposition has indicated it's an election project. Every project we have done from 2017, they have indicated it's an election project. But, Mr. Speaker, people no longer are gullible to these kind of things. People no longer just swallow things wholesale. Because, Mr. Speaker, if you want to talk about electioneering and electioneering campaigning, Mr. Speaker, the week of elections in Shosel, the week of elections, distribution of plywood, cement and lumber, Mr. Speaker. Plywood, lumber and cement, Mr. Speaker. I have been given plywood, lumber and agreement from 2017. I will not wait for the week of election to give plywood, lumber, and cement. I have been giving up, Mr. Speaker, from 2017. Mr. Speaker, you want to speak about road work, Mr. Speaker? 2 months before the last general elections, Mr. Speaker, the Montet Road was given what we thought was a makeover, Mr. Speaker. That road is in condition right now that the people in the community are clamoring for redress, Mr. Speaker, and they will get it, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Prime Minister of Infrastructure has promised me that road. So that will be another road campaign, Mr. Speaker. But it's not an election campaign. It is something that the people deserve, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak about roadworks. Roadworks in Choiseul, Mr. Speaker. My memory serves me well. I will agree, the people of Daban got a new road under the last administration, Mr. Speaker. But when we came into office, Mr. Speaker, that road was a suicide mission. That road was pure gravel, Mr. Speaker. And I remember driving down and I said, my God, boy, something will happen to somebody on that road, Mr. Speaker. And it was when we came in, we sealed that road, Mr. Speaker. And if, Mr. Speaker, I could tell you just, I want to be correct, just about 8 months ago, Mr. Speaker, a busload people, Mr. Speaker, fortunately there was a big mango tree that prevented it from going on to the precipice. You know why, Mr. Speaker? The road was built with no regard to railings or anything like that, Mr. Speaker. People's lives, Mr. Speaker, are important. And I will tell the members opposite and St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, if you want to see how a road is built, very soon they will have the Saltibus Road complete. A road that has been, people have been clamoring for, Mr. Speaker, for donkey years, Mr. Speaker, and it's going to be a first-class road, Mr. Speaker, where a lot of attention was being paid to retaining walls, Mr. Speaker, which is a critical component of that area, Mr. Speaker. You want to talk about roads, Mr. Speaker? I will give the member from Viewford South credit to what he did for our Park Estate Gaiawa Road, Mr. Speaker. He started putting some drains, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, talk about waste of resources. Mr. Speaker, I challenge you, that road, the drains, Mr. Speaker, at least a foot above the road. And you know what happens, Mr. Speaker? When it rains, the water don't get the drains, the water runs to the road. It's coming under the FIA road program. It's coming. You will see it soon. It's coming under the FIA road program, Mr. Speaker. It's coming. Take your time. It'll be a nice and scenic shortcut for you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members.
Mr. Speaker, when we first came in office, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members.
Mr. Speaker, when we first came into office.
Honorable members, take note. I am not prepared. I think I've crossed that. Honorable member Governor, I think I have crossed the threshold when standing order 43 will be used. Continue, honorable members. Susan.
I don't have much more to say, Mr. Speaker. I'll be very brief. But Mr. Speaker, since I mentioned it, Mr. Speaker, the Gaiawa Park Estate Road, Mr. Speaker, is being looked at seriously as one of our feeder roads, Mr. Speaker, and we are going to give some much needed attention to it, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I support 100% the counterpart financing to support the grant provided to us, Mr. Speaker, for the rehabilitation of the Millennium Highway and the West Coast Road project. I thank you.